I want someone to know we didn't stop being kind, even when we were scared. Those words were found frozen inside a child's notebook beneath 40 years of snow. They were not written for fame, not for history, but for remembrance. This is not a story of a plane crash. It's a story of what came after, of a white wolf who watched in silence, of a German shepherd who followed her steps, of a little girl broken by grief who learned to listen again, not with her ears, but with her heart. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The wind in Grapevine was a language of its own, sharp whispering through the pine needles curling against the windows of the ranger outposts and swallowing sound whole. In the dead heart of February, the mountains above the Colorado town vanished beneath a pale white shroud. Grapevine was known for its seclusion, its heavy snows, and the stories it buried. At an elevation of 11,000 feet, the ridge above Grapevine Lake was no place for error, and yet, that's where Dylan Moore stood alone, cold and transfixed. Dylan was 38, tall and narrow-shouldered with an engineer's calm and a climber's endurance. His brown hair was always tousled under his hood, his eyes tired from years of harsh lighting and long hours. A man of habit, not risk. But today had been different. Dylan worked for the Colorado Geological Survey. He had taken up a temporary posting in Grapevine for a soil stability report related to possible geothermal shifts. His specialty was subglacial scanning, a field usually filled with tedium and static feedback. But at 6:12 a.m., the scanner chirped, then again, then it whined. The data was impossible. There was a metallic density signature buried 40 feet beneath the permafrost. Not natural, not geological. Something man-made. By noon, Dylan had scrambled down the mountain and filed a full anomaly report to the National Science Authority. He included every graph satellite snapshot and seismic ripple he could extract. He hadn't blinked much since. 3 days later they arrived. The first to step off the helicopter was Dr. Amy Lark, the lead coordinator for wildlife and environmental risk for the NSA. Amy was 51, with prematurely silvered hair, pulled tightly into a braid, and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She was neither tall nor slight, but square-shouldered, and moved like someone used to operating in spaces built by men and run by weather. Her coat was olive drab, her boots thick and worn, and her face bore no makeup, only windburn and lines of quiet discipline. Amy had once been a field biologist in Denali. An avalanche during a winter study had taken 2 of her colleagues. Since then, she'd carried a deep belief in patterns, natural ones, behavioral ones, and human ones. She didn't trust coincidence, and she didn't smile often. But when she saw Dylan's scans, she nodded once and said, "Bring in the dog." The dog came 2 hours later. His name was Briggs, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a dense saddle-pattern coat, mostly black along his back, with russet legs and chest. He was 80 pounds of calculated alertness. His left ear stood higher than the right, a quirk from a scar long-healed. Briggs had once served in military rescue operations in Montana and Idaho, trained for avalanche recovery and corpse detection. Retired early after a back injury and emotional trauma following the death of his handler in an airlift accident, Briggs had been deemed non-deployable. But Amy had taken him in, and slowly, under her patient reconditioning, he'd found himself again, not as a soldier, but as a sentinel. Briggs didn't bark when he stepped off the aircraft. He sniffed the wind, circled once, and sat by Amy's boot. A cold gust howled up from the trees, and Amy whispered, "Yeah, I hear it too." The team they brought was small for now. Just Dylan, Amy Briggs, and a logistics officer named Cal Vinson, a bulky man in his late 40s with a graying beard and a deep southern drawl. Cal had a past in equipment transport during forest fire seasons and was good with anything mechanical, but he didn't like staying out in the cold long. "Metal down there, huh?" Cal muttered, kneeling beside Dylan's scanner. "Let's hope it's a mailbox and not another Cold War relic." They set up a temporary camp 2 kilometers from the signal point, a rigid frame tent for base ops, a snowmobile shelter, an emergency med tent. The cold was brutal, temperatures plummeting below, 30 degrees Celsius at night. Even the air smelled clean and sharp like the inside of a steel blade. That evening, Dylan brought the full 3D simulation up on a tablet. Amy leaned in. There, Dylan pointed. "That, right there, it has the shape of a vertical stabilizer. The angle matches an aircraft tail fin." Amy narrowed her eyes. "Private or commercial unknown. But it's not new. There's no flight log for this area in the last decade. Whatever this is, it's old." Briggs let out a low huff from under the heating pad. He hadn't moved for an hour, but his eyes were locked toward the ridge. Watching. Listening. Amy followed his gaze. "We'll make contact at first light." At dawn, the world was gray and frozen. The snow underfoot was a crust of ice cracking with every boot step. Dylan led the way with the GPR sled, Briggs trotting beside Amy without a leash, ears twitching with the wind. The data began to spike again after 40 minutes. Dylan slowed. "We're nearly on top of it," he said. Amy glanced around the landscape, then looked at Briggs, who stood calm but alert, tail low, ears scanning every shift of the wind. They paused on a low plateau, the signal growing stronger beneath their feet. No one said anything for a long moment. The air was still, the snow untouched. Amy finally spoke. "We set up forward camp here. We'll start a grid survey first light tomorrow." Dylan nodded. Cal began marking coordinates with fluorescent stakes. Briggs sat beside the first flag, quiet, still, and watching the mountains with eyes that had seen too much snow to ever be surprised again. Grapine's morning came slowly, as if the mountain itself was reluctant to reveal what lay beneath its skin. Thin daylight filtered through a low ceiling of gray clouds, casting a ghostly pall over the snow. A biting wind moved like a blade through the valley, moaning across the surface of the ice field where the team had set their forward camp. Dylan Moore was already up brushing a layer of frost off his equipment case. He adjusted the ground-penetrating radar sled eyes, squinting against the cold. His hands-loose gloved moved stiffly. Every movement was deliberate. He was a man who didn't rush, who didn't guess. His belief in data was absolute, but even he had felt something unsettled beneath the numbers. Amy Lark emerged from her tent, zipping her insulated coat to her chin. Her silver braid was tucked inside her collar, now her face red from the cold but calm. She moved with purpose, nodding to Dylan before glancing over the snowfield. Briggs followed close behind her tail, swaying low-fur, ruffling in the wind. He sniffed the air, paused, then continued walking with unblinking alertness. Cal Vinson was later to rise, muttering under his breath about the wind and joints that didn't like it. He strapped a toolkit to his back and joined the others, his broad figure bundled in layers of flannel and wool. The plan was clear. Begin grid-based thermal scanning and GPR surveying across the anomaly zone. Drill shallow test cores to confirm the depth of the object. Then, if confirmed, begin careful excavation with heated equipment. But before the equipment could hum to life, Briggs stopped. He had wandered roughly 30 yards east of the marked coordinates. Amy noticed first. She lowered her mapboard and tilted her head. "Dylan," she said, voice tight. "Look at him." Briggs stood rigid, one paw slightly raised, ears forward. Then he growled, not loud, not aggressive. A low warning. He circled a patch of snow once, twice. He sniffed, pulled back, then walked in a slow arc, keeping his body low. Amy walked over, kneeling. He's reading something, she said half to herself. Dylan checked the GPS overlay. That's outside our target grid. Then maybe our grid's wrong. They flagged the area Briggs had reacted to. Cal brought over the portable GPR unit. As the scan passed over the space, the lines on the monitor danced irregularly. The signature wasn't smooth, it rippled. The reading was distorted, suggesting a cavity beneath the ice. Then something stranger, a sudden sharp drop in density on one side. A void like an underground pocket. "This isn't just metal," Dylan muttered. "Something's collapsed under there." Amy looked to Briggs, who was now standing perfectly still, watching the patch of snow with deep concentration. The wind had changed direction. She stood. "Let's reroute. I want thermal cores pulled here, here, and here," she said, pointing to the surrounding grid. An hour later they began the core drilling. The sound of the augers was muffled by the thick snowpack. Steam coiled from the thermal lances, melting narrow holes down into the permafrost. Dylan monitored each sample as it was extracted, brushing frost from the cylindrical segments. Then they hit it. A sharp clang rang through the metal tubing, hollow distinct. Everyone froze. Briggs growled again, this time deeper, and began walking in a careful circle around the hole. He didn't approach, but his posture spoke clearly. Something wasn't right. Cal removed his goggles. "We're right on top of it, aren't we?" Dylan nodded slowly. "Judging from depth, it's about 42 feet down. We've found the edge of something artificial." Amy crouched beside Briggs, resting her gloved hand on his shoulder. "You found it? Didn't you, boy?" Briggs didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the tree line behind them. That was when the secondary tracks were discovered. Dr. Lark called a new voice. Sarah Lane, one of the field assistants flown in that morning. She was 30 tall and slim, with a composed air and soft rounded features that contrasted her resolute demeanor. Her reddish-brown hair was tied back in a utilitarian bun, and her gloved hands gripped a pair of binoculars. Sarah was a tracker by training, formerly working with wolf migration patterns across Yellowstone. A car crash at age 25 had taken her brother, a fellow biologist, and since then she'd held a fierce, almost spiritual connection to wilderness signs. She pointed to a shallow dip just beyond the flagged grid. "These aren't wind-formed. Something moved through here last night. 4-legged, but the path curves wide around that drill mark just like Briggs did." Amy walked over and examined the indentations. Even shallow, the paw prints were clear. She exhaled slowly. "Wolves?" Cal asked. Sarah shook her head. "Too small for wolves. And the stride spacing, it's cautious. Intentional." Amy didn't speak for a moment. Then, "We're not the only ones watching this place." The day stretched long, the sun an icy smear behind clouds. They marked the location as Primary Recovery Site A and prepared to bring in heavier equipment for phased excavation. No digging yet, just staging. Back at camp, Dylan sat reviewing thermal data, overlaying the grid with depth heat maps. The anomaly was unmistakable, something large, angled. Sarah sat nearby, sketching the pattern of the paw prints into a notebook. Her drawings were precise, almost meditative. Cal was checking inventory, muttering about fuel consumption. Briggs rested beside the heating unit, but his eyes never closed. His ears twitched with every gust. Amy stood outside alone, watching the mountains. She whispered to herself, "What are we walking into?" The third morning at Grapevine was colder than the ones before. The air had lost any trace of warmth, and even the breath from the team's mouths seemed to hang heavier in the still air, falling like mist before it could rise. A pale, overcast sky blanketed the peaks, muting the sharp edges of the ridgelines into ghostly silhouettes. Briggs was already up, sitting near the flag markers placed around the anomaly site. He was still, yet not at rest. His eyes tracked invisible lines in the snow, and his ears twitched in rhythm with something unseen. Sarah Lane, already wrapped in 2 thermal layers, and a down shell stood nearby, sketching the terrain. She had learned long ago to read silence just as well as words, and today Briggs was silent in a way that felt pointed. He's following something, she murmured more to herself than anyone else. Amy Lark stood at the temporary workstation reviewing a new sequence of GPR scans sent overnight via satellite relay. The data was getting clearer. Beneath the permafrost lay an angled structure, possibly fuselage-like, with metal composite readings. But Amy wasn't looking at that. She was fixated on the curved marks, soft striations in the snowfield that didn't match wind machine or recent movement. She'd seen something similar before. 2 years ago, in Canada, near an abandoned ranger station where wolves had once nested. The marks had been subtle, repetitive, like something pacing, for years. Dylan arrived with 2 thermoses, handing one to Amy. "No frostbite yet," he said dryly. "Speak for yourself," muttered Cal, dragging a new fuel drum behind a snowmobile. But it was Briggs who set the tone for the day. Without warning, he stood up, turned eastward toward a rocky slope, and began walking, not aimlessly but with slow, deliberate intent. Amy raised a hand. "Let him go. Follow." Briggs moved in arcs, circling wide, then narrowing in. Every few paces he paused, tested. The snow shifted, then moved again. Sarah watched his steps with a tracker's eye. "He's tracing a safe path," she said softly. "Not just avoiding thin ice, he's reading terrain. Like he's done this before," Amy said under her breath. The group followed, pacing behind him as he carved a careful trail across an open shelf. That's when they saw them prints. Not canine, not exactly. They were smaller than wolf tracks, yet larger than fox. Spaced far apart, each step dug deep and placed with weight like an animal, conscious of where it stepped. The trail curved, crossed itself, doubled back, like a memory traced in snow. Then from the ridge beyond came the first sound. A low howl, drawn out feminine, not aggressive. It was the kind of call that lingered between curiosity and warning. The team froze. Briggs stopped dead. His ears flicked, and then he turned his head toward the trees. He didn't growl. He simply sat. Out from the white came movement. A shimmer between trunks, then a form. A white she-wolf, nearly invisible against the snow, emerged from the pines. Her coat was not pure white, but pale ash with silvery streaks across her back and flanks. Her eyes were dark, almost black, with a glint of old pain. She moved with purpose, slow and steady, then stopped 20 feet from Briggs. No one moved. Amy instinctively stepped closer to Briggs but kept still. "She's not wild," she said, then corrected herself. "She is, but not feral." The wolf didn't snarl, didn't lower her head. Instead, she looked at Briggs, then at the group, then back again. Briggs stood tail-neutral posture, calm. He took a single step forward. The wolf blinked. "Is she testing him?" Dylan asked, his voice quiet. "Not testing," said Sarah, recognizing. They stood like that for nearly a minute in silent communion. Then the she-wolf turned, trotted several paces along the ridge, paused, and looked back, waiting. "She wants us to follow," Amy said. "That's insane," Cal muttered. But Briggs was already moving. What followed was not a chase, nor a hunt. The wolf, who Sarah later named Ghost for her vanishing gait, led them along a broken trail, skirting ice shelves and half-buried boulders. Briggs kept 10 paces behind her, never rushing. They descended toward a lower plateau, where the snow formed shallow basins between wind-blasted rocks. There, Ghost stopped. Amy raised a hand to halt the team. The basin was quiet, too quiet. No bird calls, no wind. The team spread out slowly. Briggs stood beside a large drift, pawing at the edge of it gently, then stepping aside. Sarah approached the edge and gently swept away snow with her gloved hand. Beneath was a circle of scorched earth, long blackened and frozen over. She gasped. This was a fire pit, she said. Up here? Dylan asked. In this cold, Amy knelt and tapped the edge with her ice axe. It rang slightly beneath the ash, and soot was metal. A plate of some kind. Dylan scanned with his handheld sensor. It chirped. That's aircraft-grade aluminum, he confirmed. Ghost stood above them on the ridge, silent. Amy looked to Briggs. He sat near the pit eyes, low head, bowed not in fear, but in recognition. Sarah looked across the wind-scoured snow. There were people here, survivors maybe. Someone built that fire. Someone waited. Briggs stood turned back toward the anomaly site and barked once, low and short. Ghost trotted away, vanishing again, and in the silence that followed, Amy felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, not relief, a weight. A story not yet told pushing up through the ice. The wind had picked up again by the time the team returned from the fire pit. The gray light had dulled further, casting everything in monochrome. The ice, the trees, even the people looked drained of color. But beneath the exhaustion, a pulse had returned to the group, a rhythm that came not from progress, but from revelation. What they had found in the snow, the burned earth, the buried aluminum, was not just proof of wreckage, but of life that had continued afterward. Someone had waited here. Someone had survived. Dylan Moore stood inside the base tent maps and digital overlays cluttering the central table. He was hunched over the latest thermal render, tracing a curved structure beneath the ice with a stylus. It was longer than they first thought, possibly the fuselage mostly intact. He looked up as Amy Lark entered, removing her outer gloves. Her face was wind-burned and her eyes sharp with determination. "We need to go in," she said flatly. Dylan nodded. "We're staging the melt grid. Core probes confirm a hollow cavity around 20 meters in length. This thing's preserved like a mosquito in amber." Cal Vinson entered behind her, brushing snow from his hood. "Generators are warm. Heaters are live. We'll start carving the trench at first light." Amy nodded, then glanced over to Briggs, who lay silently near the tent's entrance. His head was up, ears forward. He hadn't slept properly since the encounter with the wolf. Something in him had changed, an old instinct awakened, or perhaps a memory resurfaced. Outside, Sarah Lane was pacing along the newly flagged route that marked the corridor between camp and the excavation site. She had barely spoken since the discovery. A quiet person by nature, she now moved like someone listening for a voice just beyond hearing. In her notebook, she had drawn a new set of tracks, deeper this time, more erratic, zigzagging near the fire pit and looping back toward the tree line. They didn't match Ghost's. Something else had passed through recently, but with hesitation. Morning came with a white sky and frost so thick it layered the tents like an extra shell. The team suited up, and by 7:00 a.m., the excavation trench had begun. Heated lances, melting shields, and collapsible barriers created a narrow path down into the snow, revealing the buried aircraft piece by piece. Metal emerged slowly, silver beneath frost, curved and weathered but whole. A row of windows rimmed with ice. A bent wing tip. The remnants of a serial number. Then a name, stenciled faintly on the side, Northline Aviation 3047. They had found the plane. Dylan ran a thermal scan along the exposed side. Cabin is sealed, pressure hardened. That explains the preservation. Amy's voice was quiet. "Can we breach it through the main service hatch? We've got the tools." The breach was slow and deliberate. Metal groaned under the cutting torch but held firm. When the door finally gave a rush of old dry air, burst outward, scentless but sharp like a museum tomb. Inside, light beams cut through airborne frost. The interior was preserved in mid-motion. Seats lined both sides of the aisle, many with straps still buckled. A coat hung limply on a hook near the cockpit. Newspapers lay on the floor, yellowed but legible. A food cart stood in the aisle, its contents frozen in time. The eerie silence of a moment interrupted by catastrophe filled the cabin. Amy Dillon and Sarah moved carefully. Cal remained outside monitoring the melting equipment. Briggs entered last pause, silent on the frost-slick floor. His nose twitched rapidly, scanning. Sarah moved to the front of the cabin, where the overhead compartments had burst open from the impact. Scattered across the aisle were personal belongings, gloves, children's toys, a cracked cassette player. Then she saw it. A black canvas bag half buried beneath an aisle seat. Inside notebooks, a thermos, and a leather-bound journal. She handed it to Amy. The name, scrawled inside the front cover, read, Evelyn Cooper, 6th grade, teacher, Pine Shore Elementary. Amy opened the first page. The handwriting was tight and slanted but clear. December 25th, 1983. We're alive, not many of us, maybe 20. The back of the plane is gone. We're using the front cabin as shelter. It's warmer here. We have limited supplies. I don't know how long we can last. Each page documented the struggle organizing survivors, rationing food, using clothing for insulation. It spoke of children crying for parents of injured passengers slipping into silence, and then halfway through the entries changed. December 29th. There were eyes in the dark last night. I thought it was hallucination, but this morning, rabbit, fresh, dead, lying right outside the door, no footprints, no explanation. January 1st. The wolf comes every few nights. She doesn't come close, but she watches. We call her Ghost. January 5th. The children have stopped crying. They sit by the window waiting for her. And somehow, every time we think we're out of food, something small appears. A squirrel, a bird. Once a half-buried stash of energy bars like someone dug it out for us. Amy swallowed. Her hands trembled slightly. January 13th. There are fewer of us now, 11, but we are no longer afraid. We have a guardian, not a rescue team, not a radio, just her. And we believe in her now. I believe in her. Amy closed the journal, holding it tightly. I need to read every word of this, she said softly, but not here. Outside, Briggs was pacing the perimeter again. His tail was low-head, scanning the ridge above. Amy stepped out into the snow and looked where he did. There, just beyond the tree line, stood Ghost. She didn't approach, she didn't run. She watched. Sarah came beside Amy, eyes wide. She remembers she whispered. Or never left, Amy replied. And for a long, quiet moment, the past and present stood staring at each other across the snow, bound not by blood or logic, but something deeper. Something no science could chart. The snow hadn't stopped in nearly 24 hours. It drifted silently across the site, burying the trench edges and softening the metallic scars they had carved into the ice. The body of the plane now rested like a monument exposed, half emerged from its long entombment, casting a dull sheen under the low light. A silence had taken hold again, not the ordinary hush of wilderness, but something older. Reverent. Amy Lark stood at the edge of the excavation zone, one boot on solid ice, the other in freshly laid snow. She watched the ridgeline where Ghost had last been seen and said nothing. She had read half of Evelyn Cooper's journal through the night, her flashlight casting a pool of yellow across each page. The handwriting shifted with time, tighter, shakier, but the tone never wavered. Calm, observant, devoted. There had been something spiritual in Evelyn's acceptance of the White Wolf's presence. Amy wasn't ready to call it belief, but it wasn't coincidence either. Briggs moved beside her now, pacing the snow in long, deliberate arcs. He didn't sniff or dig, he simply moved, then paused, then adjusted his path again. It was like watching a compass needle learning to read the wind. "I think he's mapping it," said a voice behind her. It was Sarah Lane. Her reddish-brown hair was loose today beneath her hood, and her cheeks were red from the wind. She held her notebook loosely in one hand, the pages fluttering. "He's tracing a pattern. I checked earlier, his steps are nearly identical to Ghost's. From yesterday, from the day before." Amy turned to her. "You think he's memorizing her route?" Sarah nodded slowly. "More than that. I think he understands it." That morning they followed him. Briggs led them along a snowbank that hugged the eastern side of the fuselage. With each step he paused before the snow shifted under his paw, subtly correcting his direction. Sarah followed close, sketching quickly with charcoal pencil, noting turns and loops. Dylan trailed behind, holding a portable ground-penetrating radar pack. Every time Briggs deviated from a direct line, the radar confirmed it, soft snow air pockets, structural instability beneath. "Son of a, he's avoiding collapse zones," Dylan muttered. Exactly. The line Briggs walked traced a perimeter not random but rhythmic. Every 20 or 30 feet he would stop at a shallow depression in the snow, often indiscernible to the human eye. There he would pause, sometimes sit. Then he would move on, like checking sentry points. Sarah broke the silence first. "These aren't just safe paths, these are watch posts." Amy frowned. "What do you mean?" She pointed to a tree line slightly to the north. "The spacing, it's defensive. These are perimeter patrols." As if on cue, a distant cry echoed from beyond the ridge. Not a bark, not a howl. A sharp, short vocalization, a warning. The group froze. Amy looked toward the sound, and there, barely visible against the snow just inside the forest's edge, were eyes. Not one set. Several. It was Ghost, and behind her 4 more. Smaller, younger. But each one stood perfectly still, bodies angled just outside the tree line, watching. The pack. They did not approach. They did not retreat. One of them stepped slightly forward, a young male with a darker muzzle, and sniffed the air, but at a glance from Ghost he froze. Discipline. Obedience. "Generations," Amy whispered. This didn't start with her. Briggs sat at the final post. He didn't bark or move, but his head was turned fully toward the wolves, posture calm. Submissive, but alert. Ghost blinked slowly, then turned and walked away. The others followed. Dylan exhaled. They're not just surviving here, they're maintaining something. Back at camp, they laid out the map. Sarah drew the patrol circuit over the satellite image. It matched almost perfectly with the contours of the ice field. More importantly, it avoided every unstable sector. The implication was staggering. These animals weren't just navigating the terrain. They were preserving a route, one that could only have meaning if they remembered what it protected. Later that afternoon, a new figure arrived. Dr. Noah Merrick, a glaciologist from the University of Oregon, stepped off the snow transport with his long canvas duffel and a worn leather briefcase. He was in his mid-60s, lean, with a hooked nose and thin gray hair tucked under a knit beanie. He wore 2 scarves, one of which was clearly handmade, and walked with a slightly uneven gait from an old ski accident he never liked to discuss. Noah had a reputation for chasing climate anomalies into dangerous terrain, but beneath the reckless field reports was a man who respected ice the way some people respected fire. When Amy briefed him on the patrol path and the presence of the wolves, he didn't laugh. He simply said, "Then we're dealing with behavioral inheritance. Intergenerational territory defense." Amy tilted her head. "But not for their own den, no," Noah said. "For someone else's." Briggs, lying near the camp heater, lifted his head and gave a low chuff. That night, Amy sat alone with the journal again. One entry stood out. January 14th. The wolf came back twice tonight. She paced the edge of the snow. I think she knows where the weak ground is. We don't go out unless she circles. She leads us through now. Even the kids follow her without question. And farther down, January the 18th. There are more now. Smaller ones. Watching. I think they're hers. I think she's teaching them to watch over us, like it's their job. Amy closed the book slowly, her heart tight. Briggs stirred near the entrance. Outside, the wind blew hard, but not alone. A howl rose again over the ridge, then another. Not angry, not sad. A rhythm, a signal. The night watchers were still on their rounds. The light was dim by late afternoon. The sky dulled to a smoky lavender as dusk pressed down on Grapevine. The excavation site lay quiet for now. No machines, no drills, only the steady creak of wind shifting snow across metal and rock. For the first time in days, the team wasn't trying to uncover anything. They were waiting, watching, listening to the patterns around them. Briggs had begun pacing again, not around the plain but toward the eastern slope where the terrain dipped between two rocky spines, then vanished into deep blue shadow. He had made the same approach twice the previous night, circling, pausing, then retreating. Amy had noted the change. So had Ghost. Earlier that morning, the white wolf had appeared again at the ridgeline, her breath visible in the frigid air, her black eyes fixed on Briggs. She didn't approach, but neither did she leave when Amy stepped into the clearing with him. Instead, she took a single step backward, then another, and paused, waiting. Briggs had followed. Now they returned. Briggs trotted up the slope, ears alert, tail low and relaxed. Ghost glided silently ahead, barely disturbing the snow. Amy and Sarah kept a respectful distance, following from behind. They moved with snowshoes now, careful to avoid pressing too deep, letting the two animals set the path. "I think she's taking him somewhere she remembers," Amy whispered. Sarah nodded. "Or somewhere she wants him to remember." They passed through a narrow gap in the rocks where the wind picked up and the snow thinned. The temperature dropped sharply. Ahead was a glacial outcrop, almost hidden beneath drifted snow and hanging ice. It looked unremarkable at first, just another frozen cleft, but Ghost didn't hesitate. She stepped around a ridge of packed snow, then disappeared into the shadows. Briggs followed without sound. Amy and Sarah exchanged a glance, then stepped into the opening. The ice cave was no more than 8 feet high and 15 across, but it shimmered with strange light. The inner walls caught the remaining sun and reflected it in ghostly blues and silvers. In the center of the chamber, the snow was disturbed, flattened by paw prints. And something else. Amy knelt. There, nestled against the icy wall, were objects, an old scarf faded red and fraying at the edges, a thermos still upright, a child's mitten half buried in snow, and nearby a rusted emergency blanket folded carefully, as if placed for someone who might still need it. Sarah stepped closer, her breath caught. These aren't just discarded, these were arranged. Amy nodded. A memory, a vigil. Briggs lay down beside the scarf. He lowered his head and rested his chin against the snow. Ghost sat opposite him, silent, still. Amy touched the thermos. The metal was cold, but it hadn't been moved by wind or time. Someone or something had returned to this place. Again and again. Suddenly, from deeper within the cave, there was movement. A figure, small, unsteady, dressed in a red parka with fur lining around the hood. Amy's hand shot up instinctively but relaxed as the figure stepped forward. It was a child, Lucy Lark. Amy's 8-year-old daughter had arrived earlier that morning, escorted by a logistics officer named Carla Jennings. Carla, early 30s, pragmatic and soft-spoken with short-cropped hair and a kind smile, had been Amy's assistant years ago, and now volunteered to bring Lucy up from Anchorage when the call came. Lucy was small for her age, with honey-blonde hair tied in a loose braid. Her gray eyes, so much like her father's, were observant but distant. Since his death 2 years earlier in a mountain accident, she'd rarely spoken to anyone outside of her mother. Her world had narrowed to silence and withdrawal. Therapy hadn't helped. Talking hadn't helped. But Briggs had. The moment Lucy stepped onto the base site, Briggs had walked to her, sat in front of her, and simply looked at her. She hadn't run. She hadn't cried. She had reached out, hesitant at first, and touched his head. Now, somehow, Lucy had followed them. Amy rushed to her. "Lucy, you weren't supposed to leave camp." Lucy didn't answer. She stepped carefully into the cave, her boots crunching snow. She stood beside Briggs, looked at the mitten, then turned to Ghost. Ghost didn't move, but her gaze shifted to Lucy. A pause. Then the white wolf slowly lay down in the snow beside her pup's old marks. Briggs didn't react. He seemed to accept it. Lucy sat down between them. Amy knelt beside her daughter, unsure whether to scold or hold her. "I saw them in a dream," Lucy whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "The white one and the dog. They were looking for something." Amy blinked back, surprise. What were they looking for? Lucy pressed her hand into the snow. Someone who remembered. Behind them, Sarah knelt at the ice wall and uncovered a final object. A plastic locket on a cord, inside of which was a photograph, faded and fogged. A woman with glasses arms around 2 children in winter coats. Evelyn Cooper. Amy stood breath-catching. This was her place. Where she stayed. Where she finished. Briggs lifted his head. His tail twitched once. Ghost stood again, turned, and walked toward the entrance. She didn't look back. Amy looked down at Lucy, who now rested her head against Briggs's shoulder. The dog didn't move. "I think she brought us here for them," Sarah said softly. "But she stayed for her." Amy nodded. "And now they both have someone else to carry it." As the sky dimmed into evening, they made their way back through the pass, Amy carrying Lucy, Briggs trotting at her side, and Sarah trailing behind with the locket in her hand. Behind them, the cave remained undisturbed. A vault of memory, a chamber of inheritance. Ghost watched from the ridge until they disappeared. Then she vanished again into the snow. The spring sun was beginning to lean longer across the ice. Though the temperature still bit deep, the light now lingered at the ridgeline, slipping gold into the cold, and softening the edges of everything it touched. Snow hadn't vanished, but it had changed. The top layer thinned, turned granular, and began whispering secrets. Lucy Lark was listening. She walked a few paces behind Briggs that morning, her red parka dusted with frost, and her gloved hands cradling a small notebook given to her by Sarah. It wasn't for words. Lucy still didn't speak often, but she had begun to sketch, and her sketches told more than most could say. Each page held a new trail, a bent pine limb, a twist in the snow, the outline of a paw only half there. Amy had watched her daughter's silence transform from a wall to a doorway, especially in the presence of Briggs. The dog stayed close, not hovering, not protective but present, and Lucy followed him now, not like a lost child but like an apprentice. Sarah Lane, watching from the observation ridge, leaned on her trekking pole and smiled. She'd noticed how Lucy stepped differently in the snow now, heel down, weight-tested eyes scanning like a tracker. The girl was learning to read terrain the way one reads a forgotten dialect. Slowly. Intimately. Third morning in a row, She's found something, Sarah said softly to Amy, who stood beside her with binoculars. Amy's expression was unreadable. Her eyes had become more weathered in recent days, but there was a clarity in them now, like something fractured was beginning to knit back together. I think she hears what I never could, Amy replied. At the base of the slope, Briggs paused beside a copse of stunted spruce. He sniffed, stepped once to the right, and sat. Lucy came beside him, then crouched. Her fingers brushed a patch of hard crust, snow cracked unevenly like a spider web. She looked up toward Amy, then pointed. Dylan arrived moments later with a handheld probe and confirmed it another anomaly in the ice pack. Below was a shallow cavity only a meter deep, but within it scattered paper bone fragments, a rusted school badge. It was the remnants of a survival pocket. Later that afternoon inside the mess tent, Lucy laid the papers out like puzzle pieces. She didn't speak, but she tapped 3 sheets each partially frozen together and offered them to Noah Merrick. The glaciologist handled them like ancient scrolls. Noah, with his thin fingers and wool cap pulled low, read aloud. January 20th. We're down to 7. Miss Cooper says we mustn't give up. She says the cold can't take the stories we carry. January 22. I gave my food to Tyler. He's younger. He cried, then said, "Thank you." That was the best moment since the crash. January 25th. I want someone to know we didn't stop being kind, even when we were scared. Amy looked down at Lucy, who had returned to Briggs's side. The dog rested his chin across her boots. I think we're not here to find wreckage, Amy said quietly. We're here to find the people. That night around the campfire, a small one, burning within a windbreak of snow walls, Lucy sat with Sarah Dillon and Carla Jennings, who had stayed behind to help. Carla, always gentle-spoken, had taken to checking on Lucy each morning and offering her cocoa at dusk. As they sipped, Lucy opened her notebook again and pointed to a new page. It showed a half-circle formation in the snow like a gathering. Around it were sketches of trees, mountains, wolves. "What's that?" Carla asked, tucking a strand of black hair behind her ear. Sarah leaned in. "It's the basin northeast of the ridge." Amy arrived holding a worn piece of the plane's interior, what looked like the edge of a seat panel with a child's sticker still attached. "That's where we found the kids' jackets," she said, sitting beside Lucy. "They probably made camp there for a few nights." Lucy picked up a charcoal stick and added something else, small dots. Tracks. One set leading away curved, another set returning. Sarah smiled. "She's marking who left and who came back." Amy touched Lucy's shoulder. "Were they coming back for each other?" Lucy nodded once. Briggs lifted his head. Later that night, as Amy sat alone inside her tent, she found another envelope, one she'd almost overlooked inside Evelyn's satchel. Inside were 3 folded pages. One was a crude map of the slope. One was a list of names, mostly children. The third page was a letter to whoever finds this. "We tried to stay together. We tried to keep warm. I told them to stay near the ridge when I went back for the others. I hope they waited. I hope someone remembers what they did. Not just how they died, but how they lived." E.C. Amy didn't cry. She placed the letter beside her cot, unzipped the tent, and walked out into the dark where Briggs sat facing the trees. "Let's go," she whispered. Briggs stood. They walked to the slope where Lucy had drawn the circle. The snow had stilled again. No wind, no wolves, just space. Memory. Amy stood in silence for a long time. Then she knelt and placed Evelyn's letter in the snow. The final thaw came quietly. By late March, the snow around Grapevine had begun to withdraw, not in collapse but in grace. It peeled from rock edges, thinned across the ridge lines, and exposed long-buried brush frozen in place for decades. The light was warmer now, heavy with gold, casting elongated shadows that lingered even as the winds shifted to softness. The excavation had officially ended, though the work never truly did. What remained behind was more than a dig site. It was a place of memory, and memory didn't leave with the machines. At the summit, where the air thinned and pine trees gave way to open stone, a platform had been cleared. Stone masons, flown in from Fairbanks, had laid a circular base of dark slate. It was modest, perhaps 10 feet across, but at its center stood a single obelisk carved from native rock, rough-hewn, left intentionally imperfect, and across its face, etched deep into the stone, read, "For the souls who were never alone." Below it, the names, all 41 children, all 6 crew, all 12 adult passengers. And beside those, a final inscription, Evelyn Cooper Teacher. Witness, voice. Amy stood in front of the monument, hands in the pockets of her dark wool coat, her shoulders squared but unmoving. She hadn't spoken since they laid the last name, not because she had nothing to say, but because no words could outmatch what had been left in the ice. Beside her, Lucy held a single branch of pine. She wore her red parka still, but it was unzipped now, revealing the pale blue sweater Evelyn's journal had once described one almost exactly like it had been found among the wreckage. Amy had sewn the replica herself over the past week, as if stitching memory into warmth. Briggs sat at Lucy's side, body still ears, tilted back slightly in the breeze. His muzzle had frosted more in the past weeks. Not from age, he was still a strong 7-year-old shepherd, but from something else. A gravity, a knowing. His time here had changed him, and there, to their left, watching without stepping forward, stood Ghost. She remained on the stone edge, 3 of her pack behind her 2 yearlings, one adolescent female with a darker coat. They were silent, unmoving, and unlike other times, they did not vanish when the humans turned to look. They simply stood. Sarah Lane arrived last, walking slowly up the ridge, her gait even hands curled around a folded paper. Her long, reddish hair had been let loose today, trailing like copper against the wind. She was taller than Amy Leaner, and with the kind of weathered face that looked more at home under snow than in a city. She had been the one to draft the final record, the last entry into the project logs. Not as a scientist, but as a witness. She handed the paper to Amy and stepped back. Amy unfolded it. Final log entry, Grapevine Memorial. In this place we did not only find a plane. We found what was left behind, not just bones and fragments, but grace. We found silence that spoke. We found guardians not of flesh alone, but of memory. And we found that compassion is not the privilege of humankind. It lives in the paw print, in the howl, in the girl who said nothing but remembered everything. Amy handed the paper to Lucy. The girl read the words slowly, lips barely moving. Then she stepped forward. Without a word, she knelt at the base of the monument, placed the pine branch down, and reached into her coat. She pulled free a small charcoal sketch, her final drawing. It showed a white wolf and a dog sitting on either side of a child, all 3 staring at something beyond the page. She placed it beside the stone. Briggs lay down beside her. Not from exhaustion, but reverence. Ghost stepped forward then. It was the first time she had crossed the boundary. She moved slowly, deliberately past the humans, past the fire ring that still marked the old camp, and stopped a few feet from Lucy. The girl looked up. For a heartbeat, the 2 stared at one another, black eyes and gray. Then Ghost bowed her head. No one breathed. And then, just as gently, she turned. With one last glance toward Briggs, she padded back to the edge of the ridge, her pack following without hesitation. Within seconds, they were shadows again, part of the mountains. Amy crouched beside her daughter. "It's time," she said gently. Lucy stood, looking once more at the obelisk, then at Briggs, then at the forest where the wolves had gone. And she whispered for the first time in weeks goodbye. They left that afternoon, but not everything left with them. Briggs lingered at the site until the last snow melted fully from the trench. Then he stood alone and walked the full perimeter one final time, each step matching the ones Ghost had shown him, the ones carved in memory. Then he stopped at the ridge, looked back once, and followed the trail down toward where Lucy and Amy waited. Behind him, the wind stirred gently across the stone, and the Guardians faded into legend, not because they vanished, but because they had done their part. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they come on four paws, in the silence of snow and the breath of a wolf who keeps watch, or in the quiet courage of a little girl who dares to remember. This story reminds us that God's grace doesn't always come in grand gestures. It often lives in the quiet guardianship of nature in the faithful heart of a dog, and in the kindness we show even when no one is watching. When the world forgets, love remembers, and that too is a miracle. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the unseen protectors in your own life, the people, the moments, or even the animals God may have placed in your path for a reason. Share this story, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel if you believe compassion can cross all boundaries, even between human and animal. Type Amen in the comments if you believe that God sends His angels in all forms, even in fur. May God bless you and all who watch over you.